Welcome to session 3, I think we're up to, of Christian Worldview. We've spent the last couple of weeks talking about what it is when we talk about worldview and theology, and last week we talked about the basic sources of theology, particularly focusing on the scriptures, but this is the first week that we actually get into a specific topic. And the topic that we're dealing with today is the doctrine of the Trinity, which is, I guess, slightly awkward. Of all of the topics to start with, the one we do is the most difficult. But it's also the most fun, and it really is, I would say, the foundational dimension of our understanding of who God is. So it's a very important one, and I hope today to do my best to try and help you to understand this complex and difficult doctrine. I guess what's interesting about the doctrine of the Trinity is if I was to ask you whether or not you believed in the doctrine of the Trinity, I'd say that almost universally in Pentecostal churches you'd stick your hand up. Yes, I believe in the doctrine of the Trinity. But if I was to go on and ask you the second question, which is, well, what is the doctrine of the Trinity and do you understand the doctrine of the Trinity? I'd get almost as universal hands down to that particular question, because most people I come to before they do a class like this say, yes, we believe in the doctrine of the Trinity, but we don't really know what that is. And there seems to be an assumption out there that it's just too hard, too complex, so it's just one of those mysteries about God that we have to accept. And on the one hand, I do agree with that. Certainly, God is complex, and the doctrine of the Trinity is, well, it's not an easy doctrine. And yet, if this is what we define as core to our faith, if this is one of those dimensions of dogma that defines whether or not you're a Christian, then I do think we need to do our best to try to understand the doctrine. I guess if theology is faith-seeking understanding, then what we're about here is examining this one dimension of our faith, the doctrine of the Trinity, and we're going to try now to understand it. I guess the first thing to start thinking about when you come to this particular doctrine is to realise that the word Trinity isn't actually found in the Bible. And I don't know whether that's a bit of a surprise to you. Remember we said before that last week, that our sources of theology are the scriptures, but it's also the tradition, the faith handed down to us through the generations. And so the doctrine of the Trinity was probably, it really was developed through the history of the church, and by about the 3rd and the 4th century, it was really well accepted orthodoxy of the church. So the word Trinity is not found in the Bible, but that doesn't, of course, mean that the idea or the theological notion of the Trinity is not biblical. On the contrary, I think we can assert that the idea of the Trinity does lie at the heart of the Christian faith, since the dogma of the Trinity arises out of Christology. It arises out of the basic question, the fundamental question of Christianity, which is, who is Jesus Christ? If the answer is, Christ is God, then you necessarily come to the doctrine of the Trinity. And let's have a look at why that's the case during the course of this lecture. Well, of course, it's not our goal today. We're going to do this in a couple of weeks to spend a whole heap of time talking about the deity of Jesus. So for today, we'll just assume that. But obviously, from early on, Christians recognised or affirmed that Jesus Christ was God. And we can see this in lots of passages in the New Testament, such as John 1:1, and in fact, really the whole of the first chapter of John brings out the divinity of Jesus. You can see it in really throughout the whole chapter of John 8. You can see it in John 20, verse 28. You can see it in a number of Paul's statements, such as Romans 9:5, in Titus 2:13. There's 1,000 places in the Scripture which we use to assert the deity of Jesus. And so following this biblical record, the early church fathers affirmed that Jesus is God. As Clement observed in 2 Clement 1:1, and he was one of the early church fathers, Christians must think about Jesus as they do about God. And the reason that he says this is because of our salvation. He says, "For if we think any less of him than this, then we expect but little of him." In other words, if Christ is not divine, then God has not revealed himself to us, and as a consequence of that, our salvation is meaningless, it's mere facade. So, I don't think I'd have any problems with any of you in this room. You'd all agree, yes, Jesus Christ is divine. But can you see that if that is the case, it raises in our mind the difficult question, well, if Jesus is divine, then what is the relationship between Jesus and God? How can that be the case? And this is a fundamentally important question in Christianity, because not only do we assert that Jesus is divine, but we also follow the Old Testament affirmation that God is one. So Christianity is not a tritheistic religion. We don't believe that Jesus is God, that the Father is God, that the Holy Spirit is God, therefore we have three gods. So, in fact, Christianity follows in the line of the Old Testament. We are one of the three great monotheistic religions, which would include Judaism, which would include Islam and Christianity. And I think you'll see, really, again, the whole emphasis of the Old Testament against the surrounding nations, which were all pagan and had many gods, was the repeated refrain of Israel, which is, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. And so we have this mystery of the Christian faith. On the one hand, we've got this given, which is God is one. There is no God but Him. It's not as though God is a rock and a tree and the sun, but we have one God. That God is Yahweh. And at the same time, Christianity says, yes, that's true, but Jesus Christ is also divine. Jesus Christ is God. The early heresies of the church then, or the things that we now call heresy, remember I said last week we need to be gentle with heresies, because really the heretic is not setting out to deceive a multitude, he's not setting out to lead people astray, but they're just wrestling with complex issues of the faith. And for the first 300 years there was some pretty major heresies, and we'll talk about some more of them when we come back to Christology in a few weeks' time. But really they're wrestling with this basic question: how can we worship Jesus and at the same time affirm that there is one God? And really, most of the early heresies of the church were dealing with this particular question. And so you'd have heresies such as Docetism. Now, Docetism is the idea that Jesus Christ only seemed or appeared to be human. And we'll flesh again this out in a bit more detail later, but it was the idea that, well, because God is one and God is not human, then therefore in the incarnation Jesus only appeared to be human. It was like a mirage. And the problem with that is, of course, if that is the case, then the incarnation isn't real. Then God didn't take on human flesh, and again our salvation is worth nothing. So Christians can't go there. Probably the major heresy against which the doctrine of the Trinity was developed was the heresy devised by a guy called Arius. And again, we're going to spend some more time with him later on. But Arius's answer to the problem of the Trinity was to say that God is one. If that is the case, then Jesus cannot be divine. And he posited the idea that Jesus was the firstborn of creation. He was the most important in the creation. We worship him because he's the firstborn, but still he is a created being. And again, we have the same problem there, which was the case with most of these early heresies. If that is the case, then God did not take up human flesh. The incarnation is not real. Our salvation is meaningless unless we actually have God revealed to us through Jesus Christ. And so in 325 AD, reacting against Arius, the Council of Nicaea, which was a whole gathering of church leaders, concluded that Christ was of the same substance as the Father. In other words, Christ was God. And really what they're doing there is affirming the basic message of the Scriptures. Christ is God, and so the Nicene Creed, which you probably have heard of, has become the standard of orthodoxy for the church ever since. In sum, the Creed affirms the deity of the Father, the deity of the Christ, and ultimately the deity of the Spirit. The problem with the Creed, or what the Creed doesn't do, is explain to us how that can be so. Yes, we're going to affirm once again God is one, and Jesus is divine. By the way, if you're wondering why I'm spending time focusing on Jesus and not the Spirit, let me just step away from my notes for a second. The reason is because, first of all, the doctrine of the Trinity arises out of the question, who is Jesus Christ? Because that's the big issue. In the Old Testament, you had the Spirit, and you clearly... but the Spirit was really seen as being just, an arm of God, just really God's power in the world. So it was another way of talking about God's operation in the world. So the Old Testament has a notion of the Spirit. The Old Testament also hints at the existence of the Word. And so we can see hints in reference to Jesus in the Old Testament. But certainly the Old Testament does not present to us a full-blown doctrine of the Trinity. We only get that in the New Testament because we're interested in who Jesus Christ is. So the early church first of all grappled with the relationship between Christ and God and the Father. And once it did that, it could then make some assumptions about the Holy Spirit. So the starting point is Christology. So the early Creed of Nicaea, as I've said, affirmed, because of the importance of our salvation in Jesus Christ, that Christ was God, that the Father was God, and that the Spirit was God. But the question still remains, what exactly is the relationship between the three? How can that be the case? How can these people all be God and there still be only one God? Well, the first coherent answer to how this might be the case, coherent but ultimately heretical, was given by a group who came to be known as the modalists. Modalists answered the question of how Christ and the Father can both be God by saying that if Christ is God, then the Father, the Son and the Spirit must be one and the same. Now, what they said was, and this was headed by a guy called Sibelius, was that in the history of his revelation and in his communication of salvation, the one God takes on three forms. In the form of the Father, say in the Old Testament period, he appears to us as the Creator and the Lawgiver. In the form of the Son, say in the period of the Incarnation, he appears to us as the Redeemer. And in the form of the Holy Spirit, after the resurrection, he now appears to us as the Sustainer and the Giver of life. Father, Son and Spirit are three manifestations or modes of the appearance of the one God. But this God himself is unknowable, unnameable and ineffable. And it is, by the way, a heresy that you actually hear quite often in this day and age. I think if I was to ask you to try and explain the doctrine of the Trinity, there'd be a chance you'd explain it in those terms. You might have heard, for example, of the metaphor of the water. And under this particular understanding of the Trinity, you have H2O, which, when it's just at room temperature, takes on the form or is in the mode of water. But of course you know that if you take that same molecule of H2O and go and put it in your freezer, then that H2O turns into ice. And then if you take it out of your freezer and put it into your kettle, then of course it boils and turns into steam. So the same H2O appears at different times in the mode or the form of water, ice and steam. We'll come back to that metaphor a little later on, but one way of describing it is to think of God. Now, I've got a few props here, you're going to think they're ridiculous, but just bear with me in a second. As appearing in the different mode of the person. So what you have is, in the Old Testament, God puts on a mask, or he appears to us in the mask of the Father. Now you've got to use your imagination a bit with me for a second, because I don't actually have a mask of the Father, but you get the idea, don't you? So let's pretend that this is the mask of the Father. So in the Old Testament, according to modalism, God appears to us with a particular mask, the mask of the Father. Then, when you get to the Incarnation, the same God, now look behind the mask, remember it's the same Shane, takes off that particular mask and comes to us with the mask of the Son. And appears to us. Now, this is just what I happen to have. I've got a 10-year-old, an 8-year-old and a 5-year-old kid, so I've got these masks. So he appears to us in the mask of the Son.
But remember, behind the mask, which is just the thing that he's showing to us, is the one God. God hasn't changed. It's the one God who's appearing in just a different mode. My hair's all getting mucked up, but you get the idea. And then, of course, after the incarnation, that same one God, which is still, in this case, modelled on me at the moment, appears to us, not in the mask of a Power Ranger, but in the mask of the Spirit. So, there you go. That's just an illustration of modalism. And of course, that was one of the ways in which it was actually understood. Not with really bad masks, but somehow the one God who is, as we've said before, ineffable, out there, transcendent, beyond description, appears to humankind as three different things at different points in time. Now, I don't know about you, but at least at first glance, it does appear to us that modalism helps us to understand the doctrine of the Trinity potentially, or helps us to understand how the Father, the Son and the Spirit can be one in somewhat of a convincing way. Remember I said to you before, heresy is doing its best to understand faith. The problem, however, that the early church had with this particular doctrine was that if the one God only appears to us in the masks of the Father, the Son and the Spirit, so if we look at the incarnation, if God first of all is in the mask of the Father in the Old Testament, and then in the New Testament appears to us, I think it was this one, wasn't it, in the mask of the Son, then the issue is, or the question is behind that, how can we claim or say that God is really revealed to us? You see, while modalism seems like a logical answer to the mystery of the Trinity, the problem is that modalism suggests that God was merely acting or pretending in the economy. The reciprocal relationship, for example, between the Father, the Son and the Spirit were mere acts, were mere plays, but all the while you had the one God. Let me see if I can explain that to you another way, maybe a more simpler way. What happens in the Garden of Gethsemane when the Son prays to the Father, "Father, take this cup from me"? Is that a real prayer? Or is the Son merely talking to himself as God? Is the incarnation, is God really revealed to us in the incarnation if all we have is another mask? If the Father, the Son and the Spirit are just three different appearances of the one God, do we really have a real incarnation? Well, according to the early church fathers, this is no answer. Because in this situation, we never actually encounter God in Jesus Christ. But we just get another mask, another form of his appearance. And as a consequence of that, the early church realised, if that is the case, we never actually know God. And I said to you before about the water, the ice, and I've got this little water thing, jump off stage, I've got this little water thing here, and that somehow we could use this as a similar form of the modalist heresy. Because somehow we've got, water here, and then if I freeze that, we've got ice, and then if I melt it, we've got steam. The problem is, well, apart from the fact that I think any analogy on an inanimate object is a useless way of describing God. Because, of course, the God that we serve is personal. So how talking about water becoming three things can help us in any way to understand God is beyond me. But apart from that, you actually just have the same ice or the same H2O appearing in three different ways. So you don't actually have three persons. You don't have any real relationship between the Father and the Son. Prayer between the Son and the Father, or the Son's prayer to the Father, is meaningless. The Son's sending of the Spirit is meaningless because, of course, if that was the case, it's his own going himself. And so it really does make of the revelation of God in Jesus Christ a mockery. And so as a consequence of that, the early church declared modalism to be a form of heresy. Well, if that's the case, how do we understand the doctrine of the Trinity? And the early church did some more thinking, and probably it's Tertullian who counts as being the initiator for the Trinitarian solution to the problem thrown up by subordinationalism and modalism. And he coined the term Trinity, argued and gave us pretty well the standard formula for the doctrine of the Trinity, which is that God is one substance and three persons. And following Tertullian, and with a debate with modalists, it was the Cappadocian Fathers who really set out and helped us to understand how this can be so. And they said God is one ousia, or essence, or substance. And of course, I used words like ousia because, well, they're Greek and they're speaking in Greek. So he's one essence or ousia, and three, they use the word hypostases, or we can say centres of consciousness, or when it comes across to English, three persons. To understand how this can be so, the Cappadocians used an analogy. And that analogy was based on the doctrine of, or was based on a human person. By the way, let me just explain one thing for you. Of course, they use analogy or they use metaphor because they don't have any other choice. If you're going to describe God who is beyond you, the only language that you can use is human language. And so you're always forced to use metaphor or analogy. You're always forced to say that God is, whenever you're using human terms for God, it's metaphor, because God is not human. So to use the term Father and Son and Spirit, you're using a metaphor, aren't you? And with metaphor or analogy, you need to be carefully nuancing what you are saying about God and what you are not saying about God. Let me just explain that for a second. We all know that God is a shepherd, don't we? We get that metaphor throughout the Old Testament. But we know that when we use that metaphor, it's being used, it's not being used literally, in the sense that God is not literally a shepherd. He's not a smelly old man who lives out on a hill and looks after sheep. But we're saying God is like a shepherd because he looks after his flock, which is you and I and all the people of the world. So we're saying, we're using this metaphor to say certain things about God, but we need to be careful that we're not saying other things about God, don't we? And so that's why you can only use, and the Cappadocians in the church tend to use analogy. But the best analogy when it comes to the doctrine of the Trinity, according to the Cappadocians, was not to use some inanimate object like water, or I think I was reading a book by Adrian Plass and he tried to use a toaster. I don't know if you've ever read that book. But the best analogy when talking about God is to use the analogy of the human person, because at least persons are relational. And what the Cappadocians said was that the Father, the Son and Spirit are three hypostases, or three persons, who share the same ousia or substance of the Godhead, just as three human beings, Shane, I've got in this room Josh Doughton, who's manning the cameras, and Juhi Lee, who's my TA, and you might hear about. Just in the same way that Shane, Josh and Juhi are three persons who share a common human nature. Now, can anyone see the problem at this point? Have a think about it for a second. He says, God is one substance, and the three persons of the Godhead, the Father, the Son and the Spirit, are one substance and three persons in the same way that Shane, Josh and Juhi are three persons who share the common substance that we call humanity. So we're all human. We share this common thing which we call humankind. Now the problem, of course, is we can't push this metaphor too far, can we? Because the issue is that, does this mean then that we have three gods? And I think if we were to leave the analogy there, then yes, we'd be left with that conclusion. Because of course we are three separate people. It's not as though we're completely, that one, our humanness, our shared human nature can equate us to the shared divine nature. So what the Cappadocians did was they said, here's an analogy to start us thinking about it, but then they said we need to note, however, the difference between God and humans. And what they said was this, and this is getting complex, so put your thinking caps on and just bear with me and see how you go. In human existence, the human nature precedes the individual person. In other words, when I am born, the human nature is already in existence. And consequently, I can only ever represent part of the human nature. Now, Juhi is younger than me. So when she is born, Sure, she's completely human, but humanity existed before she was born. I, for example, existed before she was born, and so there's no sense in which we can say that we share in any one person the complete human nature, because every person only represents part of the totality of humanity. As a result, each human person can be understood as an individual. There was a time when I existed and Juhi did not, and probably there'll be a time when she exists and I don't, at least here on earth. Hopefully I'll be in heaven. So there's a strong sense in humanity where we are autonomous and distinct from one another. In humanity, the one and the many do not coincide. But in contrast, God, by definition, has always existed. And consequently, the eternal God nature does not precede each individual person, but rather each constitutes such an unbreakable unity that it is impossible to understand each individually. The three persons of the Trinity are so united in eternal, unbreakable communion as opposed to humanity that none can be conceived of apart from the rest. Now, I know you're sitting there completely bewildered at this point in time, because this isn't easy, but hey, if you just let it mull over in your brains for a second, you can get this. Let me just try and rephrase this or repeat it again. In humanity, to use the analogy of the human persons, we have three people: Shane, Josh and Juhi. We are three people, but we share a common human nature. But the difference between us and God is that you have three persons, Father, Son and Spirit. But they can share completely the God nature, because each of those persons existed in eternity. There never was a time when the Son was not. By definition, to declare that Jesus is God is to declare that he is eternal. And because he is eternal, even though he is a separate person from the Father, he nonetheless shares completely in the divine nature. You don't have three individuals in God because they exist together in this unbreakable communion, so that the one substance of divinity, which in our analogy we're comparing to the one substance of humanity, isn't divided by the temporal nature of the Father, the Son and the Spirit. Think through it, work through it. Let's see if I can give you something simpler if you don't get it. But just for the moment, the Cappadocian formula left the church with a sophisticated understanding of the doctrine of God. While it doesn't explain the entirety of God, at least it has an internal consistency and provides us with a means of conceptualising the mystery of God revealed to us in the Scriptures. Now, after the Cappadocians, we had a number of other theologians, and probably the other substantial theologian was a guy called Augustine, and I'm sure you might have heard of him. He took the notion of the Cappadocians and said, well, what else can we say about them? If the Father, the Son and the Spirit are three persons who share completely the divine nature, what can we say about the Father, the Son and the Spirit, about their individual personhood? Who are they as individual persons? And remember I said before that we're using the labels Father, the Son and the Spirit, well, because they're biblical, they're given to us in the Scriptures, but also even when they're given to us in the Scriptures, they're used metaphorically so that we are saying certain things about God and we're not saying others. Let me explain. For example, you know that when we use the term Father, it's not because God was married and literally gave birth to a child. So we use it metaphorically. Interestingly enough, we use the term Father not because God is male. Christian orthodoxy has always said that God is beyond gender. So we're not saying God is male. God is Father because he relates to the Son. And the Son is Son because he is the Son of the Father. and the Spirit is the Spirit because he proceeds from the Father and the Son. The significance of that is that the personhood of the Spirit is defined by their relationship to each other. Who is the Father? Well, the Father is, by definition, the Father of the Son. Who is the Son? Well, the Son is, by definition, the Son of the Father. Who is the Spirit? Well, the Spirit is, by definition, the Spirit of the Father and the Son. Now, there's other things we can say about the persons of the Trinity because, of course, we know that the Son was also revealed to us in the Incarnation, and so we have the life history and the life story of Jesus on the earth. But at its core, we use these terms Father, Son and Spirit because God is a relational God. The God that we serve is the God who in eternity exists in the perfect relationship between the Father, the Son and the Spirit. And so amazing is this relationship and so eternal and unbreakable is this relationship that each person of the Trinity isn't a separate and distinct individual, but is actually defined by the other person. So that the very person of the Father is understood in his relationship to the Son and the Spirit. Who is the Father? Well, the Father is the Father of the Son and the Spirit. And that's what their distinction and their personhood is. Let's see whether we can move on for that. If this is complex, that's all right. Just bear with me for a second, because the 20th century did some more in trying to help us understand the doctrine of the Trinity. It's interesting that after they developed these early formulations, and then up until probably about the late or the early 19th century, the doctrine of the Trinity started to get a bit less referred to. And by the time of the Enlightenment, Immanuel Kant went as far as to suggest, from the doctrine of the Trinity taken literally, nothing whatsoever can be gained for practical purposes, even if one believed that one comprehended it. And I think actually, by the way, that's a pretty common understanding in our churches. We believe in the doctrine of the Trinity, but it's one of those mysterious doctrines that we think is actually completely useless. Really, who cares? What difference does it make in our life? Well, in the 20th century, there's been a real revival in Trinitarian theology through the ideas of some really significant and important theologians such as Karl Barth, Wolfhart Pannenberg and Jürgen Moltmann. Don't worry about those names. But if we were to follow Jürgen Moltmann, he suggests at least 4 points that arise in the doctrine of the Trinity. And the first thing that he notes about the doctrine of the Trinity is that it's a social doctrine. And the way in which we can start to understand the doctrine of the Trinity is to realise that what the doctrine of the Trinity says about God is that the God that Christianity serves in his very essence, at the very heart, is a relational God, a social God, a fellowship of love. We say that God is love. And in Christianity, that is actually God's innate and core character, because the very nature of God as the Father, Son and Spirit who exist in eternal relationship with one another is by definition this eternal dance of love. So what Moltmann suggested is the way in which we can start to think about the doctrine of the Trinity is to use this social analogy or understanding of God. Emphasising the three persons of the Godhead, Moltmann tried to explain their unity by taking a Greek word which is the word perichoresis, which means interpenetration, the dynamic process of making room for one another around oneself. Perichoresis describes the way in which the Father, the Son and the Holy Spirit as distinct persons interpenetrate one another, such that this process of communing forms their very nature. Let me see if I can describe that. He says you have three persons, Father, Son and Spirit. And their very nature, or their unity, can be described by way of perichoresis, the notion of interpenetration. And one way in which Moltmann uses to describe this is the notion of the dance. And he notices if you get dancers together, you get a ballroom dancing, they dance. He says you can have a situation where you have two people, but they're in such amazing unity in the dance that it can be like one person dancing. Recently we had the Winter Olympics and you saw these skaters dance, and it's amazing the sense of unity and oneness that can happen when two people dance together. Now, that's an analogy. Realise the extent of the interpenetration possible in God goes far beyond the unity possible between two persons, two human persons. Another notion is the notion of two hands clasping. You have two people, two separate hands. You clasp the hands, bang. And there's a sense you can see the distinction of the persons, but in clasped hands, they interpenetrate one another such that they become completely one. In a sense, in God, so perfectly interpenetrating that they're defined by their relationships to one another. They can't be separate. They can't be understood separately. And so God is a social God, and we understand his unity by way of perichoresis. He goes on to say, according to this understanding, there is firstly no subordination in the Godhead. Each of the persons of the Trinity are equal and completely mutually submissive. By the way, that's just orthodox Christianity. If we're going to say Christ is God, then he is God equal to God, not less than God. Secondly, as a consequence of that, we can say the Godhead is defined by love. 1 John 4:8. The picture of God is a social picture. The unity of God is the result of the reciprocal love between the three members of the Trinity. God is love because the Father gives of himself in love for the Son and the Spirit. And God is love because the Son gives of himself out of love for the Father and the Spirit. And God is love because the Spirit gives of himself for the Father and the Son. And they do it in eternity, in perfect, unbreakable communion. It's such a staggering doctrine. I don't know if you can sense it, but it's so powerful. Moltmann goes on to say that as a fellowship of love, and this is where it gets profound, God invites humanity and indeed the entire creation to enter into that fellowship. So you and I are invited into the very love of God. He goes on to suggest that not only is that so in the future, but it can be so in the present. That the Trinitarian fellowship of the three divine persons is the model for true human community. That here is the way God lives, and the challenge for the Christian church is to, in the present, do our best to try and live in that same way, in mutual submission and complete love with one another, overriding oppressive power structures and living even so that the leaders serve other people, etc., etc. And so Jesus prays this absolutely staggering prayer in John 17. Father, make them one as you and I are one. And so Moltmann's suggestion is that this notion of the doctrine of the Trinity should frame, to the extent which it is able, our understanding of our relationships in the church and in our families and on earth. Well, I've gone way over time. I need to stop. There's just a couple of questions which we've got with which you can frame any discussions which you might have in your tutorials. So we've got them on the slide there. They're fairly straightforward. The first is for you to discuss your understanding of any analogies that you had about the doctrine of the Trinity prior to you doing this lecture. And I guess what I want you to think through is, well, are these analogies sustainable? Do you still think they're valid after having done this lecture? So do that firstly. Do you think you were a heretic, in other words, prior to thinking through what the doctrine of the Trinity was? Secondly, can you think of any ways, given especially what we've said at the end, in which the doctrine of the Trinity is relevant to your own life and ministry? And thirdly, and this one's a challenge, how might you describe the doctrine of the Trinity to non-Christians or new believers? Father, I thank you for this wonderful group of people watching this video, and I pray for everyone that you will help us to be able to understand our faith, to be able, to the extent that we're able, understand the doctrine of the Trinity. We know you're beyond us. We know this doctrine is beyond us, yet you have revealed yourself as Father, Son and Spirit, and yet as the one God. And I pray, Lord, you will help us to understand this doctrine not only rationally, but in our hearts, and also help us to see that this can frame the way we live our lives. I pray that in the name of your Son, by the power of the Spirit. Amen.